We're going to quickly go over neuroendocrine tumors as a whole, firstly because hardly any of you know what a neuroendocrine cell is. And for those of you who tell me you do, maybe you should spend a little bit more time studying and a little bit less time lying to me. Picture this. If a neuron is a cell that transmits an electrical signal over its length and communicates with other neurons via a specialized synapse, and an endocrine cell is one that receives chemical signals from the blood and secretes hormones into the bloodstream in response to that signal, then a neuroendocrine cell receives synaptic input from a neuron and responds by secreting hormones into the bloodstream. Now, can you think of any cells like this? These tumors are famous for their ability to hypersecrete hormones they're not supposed to, leading to all sorts of fun paraneoplastic syndromes. They're also, by the way, histologically identified by their ability to import amine precursors and decarboxylate them, known as APUD positivity in the business. The most common neuroendocrine cell to become cancerous is the carcinoid tumor of the GI tract, based on GI cells that take neural input from the enteric plexus and secrete hormones that regulate gut function. Other examples include medullary carcinomas of the thyroid, small cell carcinomas of the lung, and endocrine pancreas tumors. But the neuroendocrine cells that you should be most familiar with by this point are the adrenal medullary cells, of which there are two important tumors that you need to be familiar with.
So we've covered some neoplasms of the adrenal cortex. The next two are going to be important tumors of the adrenal medulla. Neuroblastomas, which we'll start off with, are almost exclusively pediatric tumors. Now, what does the root blast tell you? They're immature cells, much more so than the next tumor you're going to see. And that means that they don't do a great job of hypersecreting the normal products of the adrenal medulla. What does it secrete again? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, if you were expecting to see a jittery kid who looked like he got stabbed with an EpiPen, that's usually not the case. They usually don't even have hypertension. In fact, the most common presentation is actually just a huge abdominal mass that's irregular and capable of crossing the midline. Also, being blast cells, their histology looks sort of like this. Those cells that look undifferentiated and mostly like big nuclei. Last fun fact, while these tumors are most commonly found in the adrenal medulla and are almost always found in the abdomen, they can actually be found anywhere up the sympathetic chain. Crazy, right? You actually have these in your neck or near your spinal cord. It's not really a high-yield fact, but kind of a cool point. Now, as is the case with a lot of the cancers on this test, the stupid trivia actually does matter. The most frustrating questions on this test, by far, the ones that make you go, did they really just ask that? Have got to be the cancer questions. They ask you to regurgitate some stupid tumor marker or oncogene that you thought, hey, that's never going to be on the test. But they come up. They're not the highest yield things, but if you don't study them just because they're not fun to memorize, you'll be missing out on a fair number of points. So now that we've gotten my rant out of the way, here are some factoids on neuroblastomas that you should definitely make flashcards of. First of all, while there usually aren't enough catecholamines to be highly symptomatic, there are usually enough to where you find catecholamine metabolites, otherwise known as metanephrines, in the urine. This isn't sensitive enough to use as a rule-out. Remember, these immature cells aren't actually very good at synthesizing catecholamines. The other markers that you should know about are bombesin and neuron-specific enzyme, which makes sense because the adrenal medulla is practically a sympathetic ganglion anyway. You can supposedly see Homer Wright rosettes on a slide, but I would honestly just know the name. I've never been able to see him. And finally, the most important predisposing factor to remember is that neuroblastomas are associated with the presence of the NMYC oncogene. Now, a neuroblastoma is one of two common types of abdominal mass found in kids. The other is called a Wilms tumor, a type of tumor that originates from renal tissue. And while a CT is the best way to differentiate between the two, there's a couple of good ways to tell them apart in a vignette. First of all, while both are pediatric tumors, kids tend to get Wilms tumors a bit later in life than neuroblastomas. Next, Wilms tumors tend to be smooth to the touch and never cross the midline of the abdomen. You will almost certainly see a description of one of these masses to palpation on your test, so I would definitely know the key difference between how they feel. Neuroblastomas are irregular and can cross the midline. Wilms tumors are smooth and never cross the midline. For more information, you can check out the renal section, but these are the most important highlights on the differential.
Pheochromocytomas, or PHEOs as we cool kids like to call them, are a lot higher yield than neuroblastomas, and really, they don't have a ton in common with them besides the fact that they're roughly from the same cell line. It's an adrenal medulla tumor.
But unlike neuroblastomas, These are usually pretty well differentiated cells and are actually very good at secreting catecholamines. Now these tumors tend to secrete catecholamines in bursts, so they end up causing short episodes of sympathetic arousal. Now what kinds of symptoms would you expect a catecholamine surge to cause? So a massive release of norepinephrine could cause your cookie cutter palpitations, perspiration, pallor, but this is all pretty vanilla, right? I mean, everything from hypoglycemia to an MI to even a panic attack can cause all these. What really distinguishes PHIOs is the insane amount of hypertension they cause. Seriously, it's like in the 200s over 100s. Because not only does the beta-adrenergic activity push the heart to maximize its cardiac output, but the alpha-adrenergic activity causes systemic vasoconstriction that cranks the blood pressure up by Ohm's law. That's physics. Now this leads to the complaint that brings most patients in, severe headaches that co-occur with these episodes. The other major finding that helps you identify a PHIO is what breakdown product in the urine. Again, it's the metanephrines, homovanillic and vanillyl mandelic acid, along with the catecholamines. Burn those names into your head because they're major buzzwords for PHIOs and neuroblastomas. Now, HVA and MVA are actually sensitive and specific for PHIOs, unlike neuroblastomas. So how are we going to deal with this tumor? To quote the old surgical adage, when in doubt, cut it out. But hold on a moment. These tumors are actually very touch sensitive. If you even look at them the wrong way, they could flood your system with catecholamines and send you into a hypertensive crisis. So how can you medically prevent that from happening? By using pharmacologic blockade of the adrenergic receptors before you operate. A strong enough combination of alpha blockers and beta blockers, such as phenoxybenzamine and propranolol, should do the trick. Now here's the money question. Which one do you give first? If you said beta blocker, congratulations! You just killed your patient. I'm messing with you. But seriously, don't do that. See, an excess of alpha-1 activity is keeping most of the arterioles in the body at a high level of resistance. But the beta-2 activity is keeping a small but sizable portion of the peripheral vessels, to the muscles for example, wide open. So what do you think happens if you're already hypertensive and you beta block the patient? Now once you beta block the patient, there is nothing stopping all of those alphas from slamming every vessel in your body shut, making a hypertensive crisis way more likely. So what you actually do is you start out with an alpha blocker to stop the global vasoconstriction. That way, when it comes time to start the beta blockers, you can slow the heart down without worrying that your peripheral blood vessels are all going to slam shut. After you've done that, then you can do your adrenalectomy.
Finally, I'm going to wrap up with some epidemiology, which is pretty important for pheochromocytomas. First, PHIOs pop up as a part of a large number of tumor syndromes, and some estimates say that about 25% of all PHIOs are a part of a tumor syndrome.
These include, as you may remember from the neurology section, the neurocutaneous disorders, von Hippel-Lindau, and neurofibromatosis type 1. They're also extremely prevalent in the multiple endocrine neoplasias, or MEN syndromes, which we'll be talking a lot more about later. One interesting thing to note is that all these symptoms that tend to involve PHIOs are autosomal dominant. The famously cited rule of tens applies to the epidemiology of pheochromocytomas. 10% of patients with PHIOs have extraadrenal tumors, meaning that it's possible but not as common as in neuroblastomas. 10% of the patients have calcifications that they can see on CT. Malignancy, bilateral disease, and pediatric disease also run at about 10%, but it's worth mentioning that in patients with familial tumor syndromes, these actually end up being a lot more common. Alright folks, let's wrap this section up on adrenal medulla tumors with a test of your knowledge. It's time for a flash quiz. High yield fact time. What's the name of this class of metabolites found in the urine of PHIO patients, and what are the specific names of two of those metabolites? I know those names are long, so pause and take some time to think about it if you need to. The name of the class of metabolites is the metanephrines, and the names of the specific breakdown products are homovanillic and vanillyl mandelic acid. You'll often see them abbreviated as HVA and VMA. Just remember that they both have vanilla in them. Remember, you will always see these in PHIO patients but you'll usually see them in neuroblastoma patients.
Now we'll switch organs and move on to hypo and hyperthyroidism. This is probably one of the highest yield pathologies in endocrinology, and it has everything to do with the physiology. Quick review. What are the effects of thyroid hormone, better known in my physio lectures as the college freshman? Go ahead and pause the video. Try to write down as many effects as you can remember. T3 and T4, the college freshmen, have insane amounts of energy as a result of their beta-adrenergic activity, increasing their heart rate and their subjective feeling of alertness and energy. Because of their crazy fast metabolism, they can eat like there's no tomorrow, but won't gain a pound. Furthermore, all that burning fuel generates a ton of heat. There are some other developmental effects we'll talk about later, but you gotta remember that thyroid problems in adults aren't gonna demonstrate these developmental effects, but pediatric thyroid problems absolutely will. So how are these effects going to dictate how hypo and hyperthyroid patients present? If we go line by line, the effects are more or less intuitive. Hyperthyroid patients become tachycardic, whereas hypothyroid patients become bradycardic. With hyperthyroid patients, you gotta worry about things like angina and arrhythmias as well, since their hearts are working so hard. Hyperthyroid patients tend to be physically pretty hyperactive, with hand tremors and hyperreflexia, as well as emotionally more labile and irritable because of the constant fight or flight stimulation. Hypothyroid patients are usually hypoactive and hyporeflexive, and tend to be pretty lethargic, erring towards depressed. Their GI tracts actually tend to follow the same pattern. Hyperthyroid patients have abnormally high GI motility, leading to diarrhea, and hypothyroid patients have abnormally low GI motility, leading to constipation. Perhaps the most unique characteristic of hypo and hyperthyroidism is the fact that hyperthyroid patients eat more but lose weight, whereas hypothyroid patients eat less but gain weight. Now this is significant because there are a lot of reasons that people can gain or lose weight, and some of them, like cancer, can be very problematic. But thyroid problems are one of the few that can cause weight loss with increased intake and vice versa. One of the most recognizable features of thyroid disease is the temperature extremes, which makes sense because temperature regulation is one of the major functions of thyroid hormone. So, which one runs hot and which one runs cold? Hyperthyroid patients tend to run hot as their metabolism is racing out of control. Because their bodies are generating so much heat, they perspire and get hot even at what most would consider normal temperatures. Hypothyroid patients, on the other hand, tend to run cold. Next, and this isn't really something you could predict using the physiology you've learned, hypothyroidism has some pretty distinct connective tissue findings. First, it makes the skin and hair dry and brittle, and causes an interesting condition known as myxedema. It's the more than averagely gross condition of having mucinous deposits under the skin, and unlike your average edema, it's non-pitting. In hypothyroid patients, it tends to deposit mostly in the face and under the eyes. Hypothyroidism causes myxedema, hyperthyroidism does not. But Arjun, says you, I thought Graves' disease patients had myxedema too. As a matter of fact, you're correct, they do. But the myxedema in Graves' patients actually has nothing to do with the fact that they're hyperthyroid. That's just another part of the Graves' pathology. In your mind right now, I want you to start separating myxedema from hyperthyroidism. Remember that this actually tends to belong to the hypothyroid patients as opposed to hyperthyroidism. We'll talk more about that one in a bit. Finally, here's a pretty interesting fact. Both hypo and hyperthyroidism are associated with myopathies, a polymyositis-like proximal muscle inflammation. It's not one of the more common complications of thyroid disease, but the important thing to know is that hypothyroid myopathy, like polymyositis, is associated with an elevated CPK. That's an enzyme released by dying muscle cells, if you weren't sure. Thyrotoxic myopathy, on the other hand, isn't typically associated with increased CPK, even though the muscle wasting is very similar. Finally, unlike cortisol abnormalities where you had to determine where the pathology was with the gland or the pituitary or the hypothalamus, when you have a problem with the thyroid hormone, it's almost always due to a problem with the thyroid gland. So does that make it primary, secondary, or tertiary? The answer is primary, and it means that the origin of the problem is with the altered thyroid gland. Now pay attention because this is something you're going to have to do a lot in the endocrine section. In a primary process, if T3 and T4 are increased, does that mean that you're going to have increased or decreased TSH? What What about if you have decreased T3 and T4? Because of the negative feedback, an increase in T3 and T4 means that TRH and TSH are going to be decreased in hyperthyroidism. In hypothyroidism, the opposite is true. Decreased T3 and T4 will result in feedback stimulation of TSH and TRH. The reason this is particularly important is because serum TSH is the most sensitive test for hyper or hypothyroidism. In fact, it's better than straight up measuring T3 and T4. But watch out. If a patient looks clinically hypothyroid and their TSH is low, why might that be? Now this might actually be the odd instance of tertiary or secondary hypothyroidism. In that case, you need to check the T4 to confirm.
Let's talk about menstruation for a second. Remember how hypothyroidism can affect the menstrual cycle? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with T3 and T4's negative feedback. A drop in T3 and T4 will cause an increase in TRH by negative feedback. But remember what TRH stimulates in addition to TSH? It's actually prolactin, and the stimulation of prolactin will lead to an inhibition of GnRH. Decreased GnRH will lead to a decrease of the sex steroids, and therefore lead to menstrual irregularity, in some cases even amenorrhea. So hypothyroidism causes menstrual irregularity, so what? Hyperthyroidism must cause, I don't know, superfertility or something? Actually, hyperthyroidism can also cause menstrual irregularity by a totally different mechanism. See, when steroid hormones are released, they're carried through the blood by steroid hormone binding globulin because they're not very soluble, but only the unbound hormone can exert its effects on the target cell. What excess TSH does is it causes the production of way too much of the binding globulin. So basically most of the sex hormone stays bound to the protein instead of, doing its job. In this way, hyperthyroidism also causes menstrual irregularity by sequestering the active sex hormones.
Let's talk about a word commonly associated with thyroid disease. Goiter. Or in other words, the freaky neck bump that happens when your thyroid swells up. But a goiter occurs for a number of different reasons. You've probably seen it most commonly associated with kids in developing nations, like this little guy in the picture, because of dietary iodine deficiency. Now, this isn't actually super intuitive. Why should a lack of iodine cause the thyroid to grow? Remember, iodine molecules make up a large part of thyroid hormone, so without dietary iodine, you can't make thyroid hormone. But the pituitary doesn't know that the problem is with a lack of iodine. It basically just assumes that if there's not enough thyroid hormone, it's because the thyroid gland is being a lazy bum. So, it cranks up the TSH, which makes the thyroid gland grow humongously big in an effort to churn out more thyroid hormone. But of course, that doesn't help, because you can't make thyroxine without iodine, no matter how much thyroid you have. Stupid pituitary. It's important that you remember, by the way, that this huge neck bump caused by iodine deficiency isn't just an ugly bump. It actually represents an incredibly powerful thyroid gland. And if this person is given normal amounts of iodine, their uberthyroid will generate so much thyroxine that it'll push them straight from hypothyroid to hyperthyroid until their body finally figures out what's going on. This is called the Jode-Basedow phenomenon, and First Aid talks about it in the hyperthyroidism section. The reason everybody associates third world kids with goiters is because these goiters are so common and can become so big and dramatic. But this is actually the most roundabout and least intuitive mechanism by which one can get a goiter. So, for the other ones, try to think, what are some other really common reasons for other organs to get enlarged? I'll break this down into a few general mechanisms: hypertrophy, inflammation, and neoplasia, or dysplasia. Hypertrophy can occur as a function of iodine deficiency, as we talked about, as well as any other cause of increased TSH, such as secondary or tertiary hyperthyroidism. Remind me what those are again? So both of these are really rare. Secondary hyperthyroidism is caused by the pituitary hypersecreting TSH, and tertiary hyperthyroidism, which is super, super rare, is caused by the hypothalamus secreting increased TRH. But the most common cause of generalized thyroid hypertrophy is a form of primary hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease. We'll talk a lot more about that one later, but it's a form of enlarged thyroid that occurs independent of the pituitary and hypothalamus. Inflammation of the thyroid gland can cause diffuse but usually temporary enlargement of the thyroid. All three major forms of thyroiditis that you're responsible for knowing can cause a goiter. Finally, dysplasias or neoplasias of the thyroid, whether benign or malignant, can cause gland enlargement. On the most benign end of the spectrum are the thyroid cysts, which neither hypersecrete nor invade the tissue. They're just kind of filled with fluid and sit there, and are a very common incidental finding in humans. A gland with multiple hypertrophic patches is called toxic multinodular goiter, which is an awesome band name, by the way, so nobody steal it. Thyroid adenomas, palpable as a single nodule, are benign growths that often hypersecrete thyroid hormone. And finally, thyroid cancer is the worst possibility, and has to at least be considered when a goiter is found. Now, this may seem like an obvious point to make, but unlike hypertrophy and inflammation, which cause a diffuse generalized swelling of the gland, thyroid neoplasias cause a weird nodular irregular feeling goiter. Rather than the whole gland being swollen, you'll feel a weird off-center bump that doesn't really match the rest of the gland, or a huge bumpy gland if you're dealing with a toxic multinodular goiter.